Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the second part of Chapter 11, oligopoly. Okay, so four parts to this remaining section of Chapter 11. First, the distinguishing features of oligopoly. Secondly, the types of pricing behavior practiced by oligopolists. Third, types of non-price competition practiced by oligopolists. And finally, this social evaluation of oligopoly. Okay, so distinguishing characteristics of oligopoly. So we have these three sort of distinguishing characteristics. So firstly, small number of firms. So it has fewer firms and perfect competition or monopolistic competition, but obviously more than in monopoly because there's only one in monopoly. And there's a tendency for a few large firms to dominate the industry. So oligopoly is quite common in Canada. We see it in the Canadian banking industry. There's only 5 or 6 big banks across the country. We see it in the automotive industry. There's only a few large automotive producers. We see it in the computer browser industry. So we have Google, Chrome, we have Yahoo, we have Bing, we have Firefox. We have it in the computer operating systems industry. So Windows is the most common, but Apple also has iOS. We see it in the aircraft manufacturing industry. Boeing and Airbus are the largest aircraft manufacturers in the world. Okay, so a second distinguishing feature of oligopoly is the interdependent behavior of the firms. So each firm's strategic behavior is dependent on the behavior of competitors. So each oligopolist keeps an eye on the prices and product features and advertising of its competitors, and then the first firm responds with its own decisions regarding its prices, its product features, and its advertising, and so on. So this interdependence, this interdependent behavior is a consequence of the small number of players in the industry because it's relatively easy to keep track of what your competition is up to. In perfect competition and monopolistic competition, we have too many firms to keep track of, so we kind of ignore them. And in monopoly, there simply is no competition, so again, there's no one to keep track of. Okay, then the third distinguishing feature of oligopoly is the presence of barriers to entry, and we know that barriers to entry prevent the easy entrance of new competitors into the industry when economic profits are present, and economic barriers to entry or barriers to entry can be due to economies of scale. So if we have increasing economies of scale, the firm's long-run average total cost curve declines, and existing firms can keep competitors out by increasing output. They can also decrease prices. Okay, so another potential barrier to entry could be legal barriers. So if you're in the pharmaceutical industry and you have a patent on a particular drug, then nobody else can produce that. Or some industries have licenses by governments to operate, so for example, the banking industry. And then a third type of barrier to entry are so-called firm-created barriers. So if the firm can differentiate their product in the minds of consumers to make consumers think that the products from one firm are better than those of another firm, then people then potential competitors are prevented from entering the industry because they can't afford to establish that brand recognition that the established firms have been able to create. Okay, so one of these distinguishing characteristics of oligopoly is the small number of firms, and we can measure. There's a way of we can measure the how concentrated sales are in an industry to a small number of large firms by calculating its so-called concentration. Its so-called concentration ratio. I shouldn't have done that. Okay, by measuring its so-called concentration ratio. So the concentration ratio is the percentage of total industry sales held by the four largest firms. And the higher the concentration ratio, the lower the level of competition in the particular industry. And so this concentration ratio is a measure of the degree of competition in an industry. So in the little example on the slide, the four biggest firms have sales totaling $400 million, and then the firms, the next 21 firms 5 through 25, have only $50 million in sales. So the four largest firms have about 89% of the sales in that industry. So this tells us that the sales are concentrated in just a few firms. And the book provides us some concentration ratios for some other industries. On page 287, it says in the tobacco industry, the concentration ratio is 99%, and in the beer industry, it's 90%, and in the petroleum refining industry, it's 75%. Okay, so let's just move on. Okay, so in perfect competition, and in monopoly, and in monopolistic competition, we determine the optimal level of output based on supply and demand curve. So we can use our supply and demand curve diagrams to help determine the optimal level of quantity, and that tells us the optimal price as well. But we can use the supply and demand diagrams in those industries because each firm ignores the behavior of its competitors, and of course in monopoly there are no competitors. Okay, so but in oligopoly we cannot use these supply and demand diagrams to determine the optimal output quantity because the firm's behavior of all the firms is interdependent. It depends on what the other firms are doing. And so economists use a sub-branch of economics known as game theory to help understand the choices made by these interdependent oligopolists. So game theory, it's a sub-branch of economics, and it's used to describe the possible outcomes to choices and behavior of interdependent parties. So on page 310 and 311 in the textbook, this is not sort of part of the formal chapter that we're covering, but this is also chapter 11. On page 310 and 311, the book gives a bit of an overview of marketing. It has marketing in a nutshell, and it talks about the so-called marketing mix. Marketing mix. And the marketing mix is also known as the so-called 4 Ps of marketing. So we will come back to this in marketing class later on, but it makes sense to, it's only a paragraph or two long, so it kind of makes sense to read this if you have the time, because it says that in the field of marketing, when vendors want to sell their products, they have 4 factors that they can emphasize. They can emphasize product features, they can emphasize the price, they can emphasize their promotion or advertising, and they can emphasize the so-called place that the products are available at. So we have these 4 words, each beginning with the letter P, that kind of summarize all the different facets of marketing, sort of, in a nutshell. So oligopolists, they tend to compete on non-price factors rather than price. So oligopolists tend to focus on product features, promotion, so-called place, which really means the location the products are available at. So these 3 Ps rather than price. Okay, and we'll see some examples of this very shortly here. Okay, so economists use game theory to help understand the behavior of oligopolists. So we have some game theory in a nutshell here. Okay, so we have some definitions used in game theory. So we have a so-called best response function. So the best response function is the optimal manner for an oligopolist to respond to the move made by a competitor. So if a competitor starts highlighting certain features in its products through its advertising, or the competitor changes its product price, then the first firm will respond in kind, in an appropriate manner. Okay, so we have some types of games. We have so-called cooperative games. So cooperative games are games where groups of players choose their strategies through a consensus amongst themselves. And so there's an absence of competition amongst the different firms. So for example, firms could decide to collude or to fix prices amongst themselves. And just so you know, in Canada, formal price collusion is illegal under the Federal Competition Act. And we'll come back to that in law class for those of you who haven't taken it yet. Okay. So another type of game. Again, this is a game theory terminology. We can have a so-called non-cooperative game, and this means that each firm makes decisions independent of the behavior of the competitors. And so, for example, there would be an absence of price collusion between competitors. And the default behavior of firms in the industry is not to collude on the basis of price due to the high cost of such behavior, namely getting caught breaking the law. Okay, so we can also classify games on the basis of types of outcome. So we have three of these, three classes here. So we have a zero-sum game. So the total results at the end of the game remain the same as at the beginning. And so any gain by one party equals a loss to another party. Okay, and we have two more games here. I don't know why this isn't working. Okay, we can have a negative sum game. So in a negative sum game, the behavior of the players leads to a net loss to the group as a whole by the end of the game. In other words, in this game, everybody loses. And so there's a mutual destruction of the other party's interests. So the classic best example of a negative sum game, sort of the ultimate example of a negative sum game on planet Earth, at least to my generation, perhaps not yours, but to my generation was nuclear war. You know, when I was growing up, when I was your age, there was a greater fear of nuclear war in the world, that the Americans would attack the Chinese, and the Chinese would attack the Russians, and the Russians would attack everybody, and the whole world would just explode due to this nuclear war. So if we have nuclear war and everybody on the planet dies, that's kind of an example of the ultimate example of a negative sum game. Okay, and then of course we have the final form of classification of games by type of outcome is a positive sum game. So it's where the behavior of the players leads to a net gain for everybody by the end of the game. So everybody wins. So people engaged in negotiations often try to engage in so-called positive sum games because they try to find ways for everybody to win something. Anyways, okay. So again, we still have game theory terminology here. So we have this concept of a strategy. So a strategy is a rule for making a choice within a game. And the goal of decision makers in games is to devise a strategy that's more successful than the alternative strategies. And we have something called, inside games, we have something known as a dominant strategy. And a dominant strategy is a strategy that's successful regardless of what the competitor does. And so we're going to see some examples of dominant strategies momentarily here. There's the opposite of dominant strategies, where the success of the strategy is dependent on the actions of a competitor. The book doesn't tell us the name of this opposite strategy, but the strategy that's opposite to a dominant strategy is known as an intransitive strategy. It's an intransitive strategy. Anyway, that's just economic terminology. Okay, so we have some examples of dominant strategies. So the book gives us two examples, two illustrations of game theory. And the first application of game theory is to a non-business scenario, so that's this slide here. And then it's followed by an application of game theory to a hypothetical business scenario that we'll see in just a moment. So this first example is game theory applied to a non-business scenario. And I'm going to give you a heads up here. So in this example, we have a dominant strategy. Each player has a dominant strategy. And the dominant strategy of each parties is represented in the top left-hand corner. So this is the best solution for the little game example that we're going to see. So this little example, it's a famous scenario known as the prisoner's dilemma. And so we have the police pick up these two parties, Sam and Carol, and the police suspect that they are bank robbers, that they robbed a bank together. So what this example really assumes that Sam and Carol are in fact guilty. They're not innocent, but they're guilty. But the police have to find a way to prove it. And so in this example, the police take Sam and Carol and put them in different rooms, and these two people, Sam and Carol, they are not capable of colluding. Each person has to make their decisions independent of what the other does, the way this little scenario is designed here. Okay, so the police pick up these two suspects, Sam and Carol, and the police want to obtain a conviction, so they set up a little scenario, and so they give Sam two choices. He can either confess to the bank robbery or he cannot confess, and likewise Carol gets the same options. She can confess or she cannot confess. So the police say to Sam, hey, Sam, if you confess to this bank robbery, if you confess and Carol also confesses, you'll only go to prison for 5 years. However, if you don't confess, but Carol does, she gets off free and you go to prison for 10 years. And they say to Sam, hey, look, if you confess and Carol does not confess, then Sam, you get off free and she goes to prison for 10 years. And finally, if you both confess, you both go to prison for 2 years. So what this example illustrates is that both parties are best off by confessing. Confessing is the dominant strategy for each party. That's the conclusion. So the answer is why. So I'm going to, in just a second here, I'm going to tell you how to read this diagram in case you haven't kind of figured it out on your own. Okay, so confessing is the dominant strategy for each party because the consequence to each party from confessing is less painful than not confessing, regardless of what the other party does. Okay, so when you look at this diagram here, we have to evaluate Sam's choices. Sam's choices go horizontally, and Carol's choices are vertical. So let's look at the example. Let's look at Sam here. So let's say Carol decides to confess. Sam has a choice. Sam can either confess, in which case he goes to prison for 5 years, or he cannot confess, in which case he goes to prison for 10 years. So obviously, if Carol confesses and Sam confesses, he's only getting 5 years in prison. So that 5 is less painful than 10. So confessing is a good strategy for Sam. So now let's assume that Carol doesn't confess. What are Sam's options? If Sam confesses, the police let him go for free because Carol goes into the slum for 10 years. But if Sam doesn't confess, he goes to prison for 2 years. So again, if Carol doesn't confess, Sam is better off by confessing because his penalty is getting off free rather than going to prison for 2 years. So confessing is Sam's dominant strategy because he's better off confessing regardless of what Carol does. And then the same analysis applies to Carol. If Sam confesses and Carol confesses, she gets 5 years in prison. But if Sam confesses and Carol doesn't confess, she gets 10 years in prison. So she's better off confessing because 5 years in prison is better than 10 years in prison. And likewise, if Sam doesn't confess, but Carol does, Carol goes free and Sam takes the hit. But if Carol if Sam doesn't confess and Carol if Carol does, she goes free. And if Sam doesn't confess and Carol doesn't confess, then Carol goes to prison for 2 years. So Carol's better off confessing when Sam doesn't confess because Carol gets off free rather than suffering a penalty of 2 years. So likewise, Carol's best strategy is to confess. That's her dominant strategy because she's better off regardless of whether Sam confesses or Sam doesn't. Anyway, so this is how you read it. You read Sam's options horizontally, and you read Carol's options vertically. And so, because the dominant strategy of both parties is to confess, that drives them to this situation in the top left-hand corner where each receives 5 years in prison. We can see that that's more painful than if they didn't confess. If neither of them confessed, they would only go to prison for 2 years. But in this case, we've assumed that they are incapable of colluding. The police have them in different locations, and they're incapable of colluding. Okay, so we have another example of an application of game theory to a hypothetical business situation between oligopolists. And again, in this scenario, there's a dominant strategy, and the scenario is just worded a little bit differently. In this situation, the dominant strategy is in the bottom right-hand corner. So we need to see how we get there. So really, to understand this scenario, it's an application of the prisoner's dilemma to a business scenario. We just replace confession in the prisoner's dilemma with a high price and not confessing with a low price. So in this example, we have two oligopolists, firm number 1 and firm number 2. And they have a choice. If they collude on price, if they collude, they act like a monopolist. They charge the monopolist price and they produce the monopolist quantity together. And if they collude, they can each charge a high price and each can make $6 million per year. But if either one of them if one of them sort of cheats and charges a lower price, so if firm 2 cheats and charges a lower price, while firm number 1 charges a high price, then firm number 2 is going to scoop most of the sales. And so they'll make a profit of $8 million versus firm 1 making a profit of only $2 million. And conversely, if firm 1 cheats and charges a low price, whereas firm number 2 charges a high price, then firm 1 scoops most of the sales and makes a profit of $8 million, and firm 2 makes a profit of only of $2 million. And if they were able to, sorry. Okay, so if they collude, they make it up in the top left-hand corner. It's a positive sum game. This is a positive sum game. Top corner. If only, okay, so if they don't collude, and they both charge low prices, then they're going to end up in the bottom right-hand corner. So they're going to make lower profits than if they colluded. But so in this scenario, if they each act independently, each is driven to not collude. So if firm 1, again, so firm 1, we analyze it horizontally. Oh, sorry, firm 2, sorry. We look at its choices horizontally, and for firm 1, we look at its choices vertically. So firm 2 has a choice. If firm 1 charges a high price, firm 2 can either charge a high price or a low price. If firm 2 charges a high price, it makes profits of $8 million. So 8 is better than 6, so firm 2 is going to charge a low price. And if firm 1 charges a low price, firm 2 can either charge a low price or a high price or a low price. If firm 2 charges a high price, it makes profits of $2 million. A low price, it makes profits of $4 million. 4 is better than 2. Therefore, charging a low price is the dominant strategy to firm 2 because it's regardless of what firm 1 does, firm 2 is better off charging a low price. And then the same analysis applies to firm number 1. If firm 2 charges a high price, I'm going to go to a different color here. If firm 2 charges a high price, firm 1 can either charge a high price or a low price. And if firm 1 charges a low price, it makes $8 million versus only $6 million. So firm 1 is going to be inclined to charge a low price. And if firm 2 charges a low price, firm 1 either charges a high price, in which case it makes $2 million, or charges a low price and makes $4 million. 4 is higher than 2, so again, firm 1 is going to charge a low price. So charging a low price is the dominant strategy for firm number 1. So that pushes the players into this bottom right-hand corner, where each charges a low price, and they each make $4 million, so industry profits are only $8 million, whereas if they had colluded over here, they could have made profits of $12 million. Total of $12 million, and they each could have made more. But the dominant strategy for both is to charge a low price, and that pushes them down to this bottom right-hand corner. Okay. So that's it for game theory. So we have 3 types of cooperative price behavior that oligopolists can practice, and the first is known as so-called price fixing. So in those examples of the prisoner dilemma, we assume that the players played the game only once. We assume that they played the game only once. If they played the game on a repeated basis, if they played the game only once, we saw that they ended up in the bottom right-hand corner. But if they played the game repeatedly, the players would learn that they could be better off by colluding. And if they colluded, they would move up to the top left-hand corner, where each makes more. And because in this situation where they both charge a high price, they're cooperatively acting like the monopolist, charging the high price charged by monopolists and producing that lower quantity. So if they cooperated, they know that they can make more money than if they don't cooperate. But the drawback of cooperating is they might go to jail. Okay, so we have three types of cooperative price behavior that oligopolists can practice. One is called price fixing. So this is where they do cooperate. They do cooperate to charge the high price and to produce that low quantity. But we can see from this example, if they cooperate, each firm has an incentive to cheat. So if they start off each charging a high price and they think they're going to make $6 million a year, if firm 2 cheats and charges a lower price, it does so thinking that if it lowers its price, it can scoop a larger market share and make more money at the expense of the other guy. And likewise, so there's an incentive here. There's a very strong incentive for each party to cheat. And this incentive to cheat is what we actually see in the world with OPEC. OPEC is oil-producing, exporting country cartel in the oil industry, and they try to set prices and output quantities, but there's always these little cheaters on the fringe that tries to lower its price and scoop a larger market share at the expense of the cooperators. Okay, so we can have price fixing. That's one form of cooperative pricing. And the book mentions 2 related kinds of behavior. There's so-called opportunistic behavior. So opportunistic behavior means the party focuses on its short-run gains while ignoring the benefits from long-term gains. So that's kind of what cheating might get us to. And then there's a tit-for-tat strategy, which means that it's a strategy for responding to another party that cheats. So if one party cheats in this period, in the next period, the other parties will retaliate by lowering their price and then throwing everybody into a worse situation. So one party cheats in this period to retaliate against cheaters in the previous period. Okay, so let me just try to write this down. Okay, so our second form of cooperative pricing behavior that we can see amongst oligopolists is so-called cartel. So cartel is a quantity fixing. It's quantity fixing. So the industry players agree to produce the quantity that a monopolist would produce, so a lower quantity than we would see in perfect competition. And they can allocate output quotas to the different members. And the whole purpose is to raise the price and reduce the quantity to monopoly levels. And so we see this in the oil industry, in OPEC. We see it in the diamond industry through De Beers, the biggest diamond producer in the world. And believe it or not, we actually see it in Canada. Canada's quite famous around the world for its cartel in the potash industry. Now, cartels are illegal inside Canada, But Canada is famous for its potash cartel. But it's not illegal in Canada because the cartel operates outside the country. It doesn't practice cartel practices inside Canada, just outside the country. And so there's that's fair game. And that's fair game the way laws work in Canada. Okay, then the third form of cooperative price behavior that we can see oligopolist practice is so-called price leadership. So this is where there's informal price collusion by the players in the industry. So what happens is the biggest kid in the block kind of publishes its prices, and so everyone else in the industry knows what the big guy is charging. And so all the smaller players, they follow the practice of the big guy, and so the big guy effectively sets the prices for the whole industry. And the book is an example of that, of the Canadian banking industry. A few years back, Bank of Montreal was kind of the leader in I think it was the residential mortgage industry. They would kind of set their interest rate, and the other banks would follow suit. But it's informal price collusion, not formal, so a little bit tougher to throw them in jail. Okay, so we have 4 factors that contribute to cooperative pricing behavior amongst oligopolists. So the first factor is a small number of firms in the industry. There are fewer players to coordinate than in perfect competition or monopolistic competition. So when you have few players, you're more inclined to get cooperative pricing behavior. The second factor is, I don't really like the way the slide is written here. It's not really the growing industry. It's the state of the industry. It's the state of the industry. So if we have an industry that's in a growth phase, then it's easy for the players to obtain market share without competing on the basis of price. And so when the industry is growing, there's a tacit agreement amongst the players not to compete on the basis of price. But when the industry goes into a recession, then the price cheating starts. Then the tacit agreement not to compete on price goes away, and then they start cheating. So in good times, there's more informal cooperation than in bad times. Okay, and then we have whoops. Okay, so another factor that contributes to cooperative price behavior amongst oligopolists is them having identical products, because if they have identical products, it's easy for customers to switch suppliers, and so it's easier for the rival producers to punish cheaters. And then finally, another factor that can encourage cooperative pricing behavior is the absence of laws against price collusion or against price fixing. So this does not apply to Canada, because Canada does have laws against price fixing in the Competition Act, but not all countries have these kind of laws. Okay. Okay, so we have some oligopolist pricing practices that can deter entry into the industry. And one of these potential practices is known as predatory pricing. So predatory pricing is cutting the price of your product to discourage new entrants. So this might occur if the industry has increasing, or the players have increasing economies of scale. They can cut their prices simply by increasing output. In Canada, predatory pricing is legal if it's to match the prices that your competition is charging, but it's illegal if the purpose is to put competitors out of business. It's kind of it's a complicated field, the Competition Act in Canada. Okay, I'm just going to skip a slide. Okay, so we have so we have several types of non-price competition practiced by oligopolists. And so we mentioned earlier that in marketing, marketers market their products on the basis of these so-called 4Ps: product features, price, promotional activities, and place the product is available, otherwise known as location. So oligopolists can compete on some non-price factors, and the biggest non-price factor is so-called product differentiation. So here the companies can focus on the product features, or maybe their advertising, and instead of on the basis of price. So there's a bit of an evaluation in the book on the social value of advertising, and so there's a view that advertising is kind of a wasteful activity in the economy, but then there's also some beneficial aspects of advertising. So the drawback, or a drawback of advertising, is that it adds to product costs, but advertising doesn't necessarily convey information about the product. It can convey non-product information. And a lot of advertising is focused on building brand image in the minds of buyers. And so brand image, it's not actually a product feature. And brands can serve as a barrier to entry because potential new entrants into the industry might not be able to afford the marketing expenditure required for their products to gain recognition in the market. And with branded products, the price charge often exceeds marginal cost and average total cost, and that results in economic profits and allocative inefficiency. Okay, however, there is an advantage of advertising, and that is when brands are established in the minds of consumers, it can save consumers time when they go shopping, because when they go shopping, they can focus on the product that they're familiar with rather than having to spend all this time looking at alternative products and evaluating them. So brands enable shoppers to use some shortcuts in the shopping process. Okay, so another form of product differentiation is so-called innovation. So oligopolists, because they earn economic profits, they can afford to invest in research and development. And so they come up with new and improved products or new and improved production techniques. And so they can compete on the basis on non-price factors. Okay, so a couple of additional forms of non-price competition that oligopolists can engage in. One is called exclusive dealing. So this is where the vendor only sells the product to the buyer on the condition that the buyer does not buy similar products from other competitors. And so, for example, at gas stations, they might be locked into buying their fuel supply from a particular refinery. And so that reduces price competition in that particular market, and it makes the product to the final buyers higher. And this is actually common in businesses that are franchised. The franchisee often has to buy materials or supplies from the franchisor, which is the head office. Okay, and then another one that's not mentioned on the slide here is called raising switching costs. Switching costs. So the vendor gets you to buy their product, and they make it difficult for you to switch to the product of a competitor. And so by making it difficult, it makes the price elasticity of demand more inelastic, and that allows the vendor to charge higher prices. So this is quite common in the computer industry. You know, you buy a computer and it comes with a pre-installed operating system, and that operating system will not run the software of competitors. Or another example from the book is banks giving points to credit cards issued by that bank, and so the points do not transfer to other banks. So the bank is trying to get you to use their particular credit card, whether it's Visa or MasterCard, or there's some private ones out there too. Okay, so the final little section looks at the social evaluation of monopoly. So there are some advantages of an oligopolistic industry. So oligopolistic industries can be more productively efficient if there are increasing economies of scale for the players. And so it's more cost effective to have just a few players rather than many smaller ones. And another advantage of oligopoly is the economy having more R&D performed, because oligopolists earn economic profits, and they don't like to compete on the basis of price, so they spend their profits on developing new product features or new products. Okay, and then finally we have some disadvantages of oligopoly, and so we can have some productive inefficiencies in oligopoly because there's an absence of competition. In perfect competition, economic profits are competed away when new parties enter the industry, but in oligopoly we have barriers to entry, and so there's not a strong competition in oligopoly, and so oligopolists don't have to be as cost conscious as in perfect competition, and then they end up spending some of their money on sort of unproductive forms of non-price competition, namely advertising and branding. And then the second drawback of oligopoly is they produce a lower quantity and a higher price than we would see in perfect competition, because the firms in the oligopoly tending to work as if they were actually a monopoly, so lower quantity and higher price than we would see in perfect competition. Okay, so that's it for the final class of industries that we looked at in economics. So we've looked at perfect competition, monopoly, monopolistic competition, and oligopoly. And that's it for chapter 11. Oops.